Where a lot of people get their knowledge about market research today is from companies such as Google that run PPC ads. So they're going to be looking at some pretty basic measurements such as A/B tests and perhaps some focus on short-term behavioral metrics. That's why I think it's important to really take a much more macro view at how advertising works and look at the research that's involved that goes much more beyond just Google ads and looking at things like how do we measure success when we did TV ads and print ads. This will enable us to create a much more long-term, coherent, integrated marketing strategy. So what we're going to do in this video is I'm going to give you some research lessons from the book Advertising Strategy. I have a copy of it here. It's very high level and very comprehensive. So we're not just looking narrowly at one specific channel, such as HubSpot or Google Ads or Facebook ads. So I want to give full credit to this book for the following lectures. Now, one of the case studies here is looking at Reebok in the 1980s. So the key to Reebok's success was really this insight. And this insight was that most people who wore athletic shoes weren't actually engaging in sports. They weren't actually using it for athletic purposes. So when they realized this, when the research showed this, what they started doing was they showed ads of people doing non-athletic activities wearing Reebok shoes. So doing things like picnicking. As a result of this research and this key insight and an advertising campaign that was built around it, Reebok became even bigger than Nike. They became the leading athletic shoe brand, which is a momentous accomplishment. However, what happened afterwards was that market share dropped as people's leanings changed. So they no longer wanted to wear athletic shoes casually. Instead, they wanted to wear brown shoes. So the other thing that comes out of this strategically is understanding that the target market is not just who are the specific customers that we're trying to target, but it's also looking at macro trends. And that's one of the most important elements of research is seeing what is trending in the market. Because often what I see is when there's a surge in demand for something, the market can actually support a lot of competitors. So even though you face a lot of competitors, you're going to make more money by participating in that space. Now, in Reebok's case, it was actually the opposite. There was a downturn, and then they never fully recovered from that. They've been completely dominated by Nike. So it shows the importance of insights to drive advertising strategy. Now, when we're looking at print ads, how do we estimate the audience? So there are a couple of key ways here. One is you estimate the readership using circulation data, and you can get this from different sources such as the Audit Bureau of Circulation. The Standard Rates and Data Services also supplies this kind of information. So basically what you're saying is however many people receive this newspaper, magazine, or whatever is our estimate for who the audience is. Now, that's not going to be completely accurate. Not everybody's going to read what they receive, but it's a good rough rule of thumb to compare different publications. Another key thing that you can do is you can do an audience measure using surveys. So you can take a sample of consumers, make sure that they admit that they're familiar with a particular publication. So you eliminate anybody that isn't familiar with the New York Times or whatever it is that you're trying to measure. And then you run a survey and you start finding out information about whether they meet your target criteria. So for example, are they middle-aged women? You can also ask them other questions too. Now, how do you estimate audiences when it comes to television? So one of the most reliable sources for this is using Nielsen. So this is what I used to track. I used to use Nielsen to track things like brand awareness and willingness to pay, and they supply some very useful data, but they supply even more robust data depending on how much you're willing to pay. So what Nielsen does is they recruit samples of 25,000 people, and they give them what are called people meters that tracks their TV channels, and it also tracks whether the TV is actually on. So if you think about it, most of the day, people aren't really watching TV. They're at work or they're cooking, and then suddenly there's a surge of people after dinner time that are watching TV. The other thing that Nielsen does is it gets people to report who is watching, which isn't that reliable when it's something like a child, but it will probably be pretty reliable when it's the father or the aunt or the mother. And They also get people to write diaries. So you're getting some more qualitative feedback as to what's happening. Now, other things with TV estimation is we have the HUT, which is the houses using television. And one thing that we know at this is that the number of houses that use television peaks at around 60% at prime time. And then we also have the PUT, the PUT, people using television. So this is similar to the HUT. The difference here is we're tracking individuals rather than households. We have share of audience, which is the percentage of people tuned into a particular channel divided by the number of houses that are using television. And then lastly, and this is the one that most of you have probably heard before, is the ratings. So this is usually what television people are talking about. We need to increase our ratings. And this is the percentage of all homes tuned into a particular program. So now I want to give a case study where we're talking about television advertising. And it's for Gatorade. So Gatorade got bought by Quaker Oats, and Quaker Oats needed to decide, are we going to do one big national campaign or separate regional ones? So this is the kind of thing where you're going to need market research to drive decision making. Now, one of the reasons that they needed to make this decision is because they acquired this product, which was very well known in the southern US, and particularly in Florida. And because that geography was more familiar with Gatorade, they were wondering if they should run a separate campaign for the North that appeals more to newbies who need to be educated more, and then a separate campaign for Southerners. But the problem here is that you needed to justify the cost because you would have to generate and distribute two separate campaigns, and then you just have the fixed cost of needing to manage both of those. So what they did is they did a test market. So a sample of viewers comprised of Northerners and Southerners. They created a campaign with mass appeal, so to appeal to everyone. They also created another campaign that addressed Northerners' limited knowledge, so specifically cater to that audience and their level of education. And what they discovered from this test market, from this market research, was there was similar performance when you measure things like liking and intention to buy. So what Gatorade decided to do was just to do one big national campaign. And increasingly, this is what we're seeing on a macro level in marketing, is the importance of going for wide reach, mass appeal, despite the commonly held myth, perhaps, that target marketing is better. You get more economies of scale by going for broad targeting. So research is also able to help us with budgeting. Now, if we look at how traditional budgeting is done in marketing, it's usually a percentage of sales. So let's say 15% of revenue, we're going to allocate that to marketing communications, to advertising. A second way to do budgeting is to look at share of voice. So this is basically looking at your competitors and seeing how much are you spending on advertising relative to your competitors. So what you're looking at is the ad expenditure that you have versus all expenditures for advertisers in the category. And that's going to tell you what your share of voice is. Now, there are a number of flaws with this. So one is that it assumes that competitors are wise, that they're doing the right thing. And then the other thing is that it kind of ignores effectiveness. It's sort of saying, well, $1 spent on marketing here is the same as $1 spent on marketing there. So there's kind of an implied efficiency there, suggesting that you're not really able to extract more out of your budget. But of course you can. If you do an effective campaign, it'll be more effective. You'll get more reach for your dollar. You'll get people to remember you more. You'll get people to buy more. A third approach to traditional budgeting is just all that you can afford. If you only have $200 a month, then that is your advertising budget, and that's what you go with. Very, very simple. Now, I have a little asterisk here, which is that when you're looking at data with budgeting and you're making decisions, you need to separate short-term impact from long-term impact. So if for example, you only run a test for 1 week, but you plan to run the campaign for a year, then you need to really identify that fallback in your research, because some things take very long to have an impact. And I'm going to repeat that over and over throughout this lecture. So those were the traditional approaches to budgeting. Now we're going to talk about the empirical approaches to budgeting. So we're actually testing in the real world here. Um, So one of the easiest ways or most obvious ways to do this is to identify a test market, which is often a city or multiple cities. And you're going to choose those markets based on usually two criteria. One is representativeness. So do these people represent the rest of the country? I've done some research where we would identify different cities. So I'd run a test in San Diego. I'd run another test in Chicago to get the mid-market. And then we thought that based on those two cities, that we could have a good idea of what the rest of the country is going to feel in terms of new products that are coming to market. Now, another thing to consider with empirical budgeting is not just running a test, but running a specific type of split test. So you're probably familiar with split tests, which is A/B tests that are run through digital ads, but we can also do this with cable television. So what happens here is we take cable TV and we split it with different messages, different advertising weight, and different media schedules. And what we can do is we can collect scanner data at supermarkets that is linked to individuals. And then we're able to see the individuals that were hit with this message at this time with this much budget ended up buying, or these people didn't end up buying. And we can observe how different levels of advertising impact sales by varying what those weights are. Now, once again, I want to highlight that behavioral change is kind of a short-term thing that we're measuring, but the bulk of advertising, the effectiveness is actually long-term. It's building share of mind over a very long, extended period. If you think about a brand like Nike, how many decades did it take for that to build as a brand? So it's very limited when we're only looking at things like sales, because it kind of implies that the effectiveness of ads is short term, when in reality, most buyers are going to buy far into the future. So just take that with a grain of salt when you're looking at behavioral tests using things like split tests. Now, the other cheaper option when you're doing empirical budgeting is correlation analysis. You're basically looking at how ad expenditures vary and how sales vary with it. Now, this is basically looking at correlation. So it's not necessarily true that causation is the factor here. So you might have to make some key assumptions there, but it's cheap, it's quick. You can get your business intelligence team or your analytics team, whatever you have, depending on the size of your business. If you're a one-person business, then it's just going to be you. But you can ascertain some insights there. Now, once again, I want you to factor in long-term impacts. So if you're looking at 1 month worth of budget in terms of advertising and you're looking at the sales for that month, that's not going to be very accurate, because often what happens in advertising is the advertising you do at the beginning of the year will produce results at the end of the year. Or if you're doing business to business, for example, you might be obsessed with this quarter's revenue numbers, but it's actually this quarter's advertising is producing the pipeline for the next quarter or for the next half year. So be very, very careful about how you're doing this analysis and think about the types of advertising you're running. Is it designed for long-term growth, or is it more just short-term sales activation? Next, we're going to talk about measuring advertising effectiveness, looking first at TV ads. So one thing that you can do with TV ads is you recruit people to watch programs with ads to be tested, and then you also have controls to see normal behavior. So before they view the ads, you're going to ask them their brand preferences, and then afterwards you ask them their opinions. So what you can gauge here is here's the baseline. This is what they preferred, and then after watching the ad, maybe they prefer our brand less, or they prefer competitors' brands more, something like that. So there are two purposes here that we're really looking at. It's number one, to determine the impact of an ad. How effective was that ad? But the second thing, and this is the part that a lot of people miss when they do market research, is the insight. Insights are incredibly valuable. And in particular, we're talking here about insights about why ads had a particular effect. Because often we have assumptions about why or why not that are completely wrong. So for example, it could just be they misunderstood the headline. It's not that the benefit in that headline was weaker. It's that they didn't understand how it was communicated within the context of real advertising. So now we're going to talk about some key measures with advertising research. So number one here, top of mind awareness. This is where you're going to give a category cue. So for example, you might say bicycles, and then you prompt retrieval of brand names. So it's like, what brand names of bicycles can you name? And you might say Giant, you might say Norco, and hopefully whatever brand you're marketing comes to mind. If it doesn't, you probably have a top of mind awareness problem. Another thing that we can do related to this is look at perceptual measures. So for example, we'll present info to prospective customers to assess the prominence of a brand name. So for example, you might say B blank 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 LS, and if someone's able to say, oh, that's Bullseye, then we know that they have some knowledge of the brand name. It's somewhere stored in their minds, even if it didn't come to them top of mind. So consumers recognize brand names, but can't necessarily retrieve from memory without certain context. So if they can retrieve the name with some sort of cue like this, they probably paid attention to an ad where you're marketing something like Bullseye. Now, another thing that we commonly see with channels such as Facebook when you're running brand awareness campaigns is they're going to measure awareness using ad recall, which has its advantages, but also has its disadvantages. So what consumers are asked is to indicate the ads that they saw, and then they're asked what they saw and learn. So getting a little more detail about that. So for example, you might ask, do you remember seeing an ad for a car? Now, you might have seen these little surveys that pop up. You might see them on YouTube or Facebook. What they're doing here is they're getting a little more sophisticated in how they measure advertising effectiveness. They're no longer just looking at behaviors like clicks. They're also looking at feedback from viewers. And this would be a good start for that. Now, you might also ask a more pointed question. Do you remember an ad for VW, for Volkswagen? One thing to note here is that consumers often struggle to remember the origin of their knowledge. So they might know something about your brand, but they don't know that it came from a particular ad. The reason for this is because of how knowledge gets stored in the mind. It's less interested in where that information came from. So one way to work with this is to start looking at brand as a measure rather than the ad itself. So we'll ask things about brand recall. So for example, you might randomly assign people to groups, expose them to different ads, and then ask them information about the brand. So you're exposing them to different ads, but the way you're measuring success is based on brand factors. And here you're able to surmise that how effective the ad was using outcomes that relate it to the brand itself. Other key measures, so attitudes. So you might ask people how they feel about a particular brand in a given product category. So the example here is, please circle the number that best reflects your opinion about eating at Fuddruckers, starting with good at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 being bad. And then you might even ask a follow-up question, how confident are you in the answer you just gave? And then you would give them a similar scale to see if they're just sort of randomly picking a question, or are they super confident in what they're saying. Another thing you can do, and I did this sort of test before, is a moment-to-moment measure. This is where you present info to respondents and get them to turn a dial to indicate their level of interest in an ad. So for example, I'll be brought into a room to watch an advertisement. I'll have a little dial. And when I find the ad really interesting, maybe there's an exciting moment, I'll turn the dial up to 10. And then I get a little bored, I'll turn it down to 0. So one of the most useful cases for this is to figure out what parts of an ad to eliminate. So cut out the boring parts where they stop paying attention. This would be very useful with something like YouTube, where you're constantly trying to keep people engaged. More objective measures would be physiological measures. So looking at things like pupil dilation, eye movement, voice stress, and being able to see what people are paying attention to or ignoring. Similar to this would be looking at eye tracking software. There's click software to be able to look at what people are clicking on landing pages on websites. There's plenty of these out there that would be much cheaper than doing actual eye tracking. You can also look at what's happening in people's brains, so looking at MRIs, EEGs, etc. Behavioral measures are also important, so looking at test markets with different ads and see the variations in purchases that are happening between those test markets. I gave you some examples earlier. And we can also look at purchase intent and willingness to pay. So often when I do consulting for SaaS companies or I work for SaaS companies, there'll be a willingness to pay survey that was used to help determine what the pricing tiers would be. Purchase intent was something I practiced and followed when I was looking at CPG marketing. For example, there's sometimes a misalignment between brand awareness and purchase intent. So you might have high brand awareness, but low purchase intent, and that would be a problem that you need to diagnose and fix. But all too often, people's biggest problem is usually just lack of awareness. It's not that they're not willing to pay for it or they consider you weaker than the competitors. It's just that they've never heard of you, and that's why they're not willing to buy from you. So what you would do with this type of research is you would ask people their intentions after they viewed an ad and compare it to people that didn't see the ad, and then you can see the effectiveness. You can also look at things like brand switching and loyalty, and in cases like this, you would ask their preferences before they see the ad and after they see the ad. A key consideration here, and this is something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about lately, is the number of exposures. So the frequency is a very important factor. Now, there's some research to suggest that the ideal frequency is 1. The idea here being that it's always more advantageous to reach more people than to reach the same people twice. But this isn't true in all cases. I was talking to a colleague of mine where he found the optimal frequency to be 7 for the entire campaign, at least in terms of generating short-term results. So it also depends on your goal. If it's more long-term, low frequency is probably your ideal to spread your budget more over time across more people. So number of exposures. An example would be here, if ad A outperforms after 3 exposures, it's likely to outperform at any number. This is sort of the assumption you're making when you're doing tests based on exposures. Is if ad A was optimal at 3, then it'll probably be optimal at 7 and 8. Ads that require a lot of processing require more exposure. So maybe you have a complex ad that's trying to educate people, which very much would be true in the case of something like enterprise business-to-business products, where you probably need a longer text. Then the ideal effectiveness of that ad isn't going to peak until a number of exposures, until the frequency reaches a certain threshold. So if that's true and you only run a test where you're exposing people to the ad once, which was a lot of the examples I gave earlier, you're going to draw the wrong conclusion that a particular ad is better than another when that may not be the case. One ad may be better at a frequency of 1, whereas the other ad starts to surpass it at a frequency of 3, and then maybe there's wear out beyond that. So ad use is determined by frequency. Simple ads may only require a frequency of 1, and you really need to think about what kind of frequency you're planning to make decisions. Another thing to factor in is the context. So there's laboratory environments, there's real world environments, and there's other different types of real world environments. So for example, some ads may be more effective in the context of unrelated ads. So for example, if I'm running Facebook ads for business to business software, which a lot of business to business software companies don't do, then the people on Facebook are going to be seeing ads perhaps for e-commerce, fashion brands, for electronics, etc. An ad that will stand out in that context, my ad, might be very different from a different context where I'm being compared to a lot of competitors. And perhaps that's more likely when I'm advertising through LinkedIn. All right, 3 key considerations in copy tests. Number 1, behavior is not the only important factor. You have to look at things like motivations, etc., if you really want to get valuable strategic insights. Number 2, you want to consider testing how the number of exposures affects performance. The tendency with something like Facebook ads is for the frequency to get really high, especially if you're maximizing something like video views. But that may not be ideal for you. You might need to lower your budget or increase your reach to try to get the frequency down. The other thing is that the context creates bias. So if you run a test in a particular context, a laboratory environment, a crowded environment, an uncrowded environment, that may favor a particular ad, that's not going to be the best in the context that you actually want to run it in. So that concludes my summary. Once again, these are research insights from the book Advertising Strategy.